Hi, I'm Bob from INSYDIUM. We make xParticles and cycles 4D. And in this tutorial video, we're going to be recreating this scene from the xParticles reel. So this scene is all about particle advection. We're going to be setting up an xpReel fire and smoke simulation that's going to push around our particles. We're also going to be integrating our xParticle system within the inbuilt Cinema 4D Mograph tools, and then we're going to burn in some really important particle colour data into our cache. This is what we're going to be using later on when it comes to render time. So let's get started. So let's build our scene. So we'll start off by going to the xParticles menu and bringing in an xpReel domain. This is where we're going to be simulating our xpReel gaseous simulation. So that's that. Now we need to produce the object from which we're going to emit our gas, and also where we're going to be emitting our particles from. And the way in which we're going to do this is we'll start off by bringing in a cylinder object, and this cylinder object, that's going to be way too big, so let's give it a radius of maybe 2 and a height of 4 maybe. So let's have a look. So we've made this tiny little cylinder there. Okay, and that's actually a wee bit too small. So let's go with a radius of 5 and a height of, height of 4. We'll keep the height of 4, and that looks all right for now. We can make adjustments in a bit if we need to. Right, so what we're going to do is we want several cylinders to emit from, and the quickest way of doing that is to use Mograph. So with the cylinder highlighted, I'm going to hold the Alt key and then go to the Mograph menu and pick cloner, and it automatically makes the cylinder a child of this cloner. And then if I just dolly out a bit, so the cloner is set to, in a linear fashion, clone objects on the y-axis, and it's set to 3. So if I put this up, it'll make more or less. So we don't want linear, we want to make a grid array. Now we have an array of cylinders, and we don't want multiple ones on the y-axis, just one. That's it. So we've got kind of like a flat grid of cylinders, and we've got 9. That'll probably be enough. Now we can add this later. I mean, it's Mograph, which means it'll remain editable the whole time, which is cool. It remains parametric, which is nice. So let's add a little bit of randomness to this, because at the moment we've just got these laid out in this grid-like pattern, which isn't going to look good. So we'll go to the cloner, and with the cloner highlighted, we're going to go to the Mograph menu, to the effectors menu, and we'll pick a random effector. And by default, suddenly the clones are all randomly moved around. Let's go to the random effectors parameters, and by default it's got position enabled, and we've got random movement on the X, Y and Z axis. So let's take away the Y random movement, because we don't want that. So now it's just randomly spaced out on the X and the Z, which is not bad. And let's do a little bit of random scale as well. So we want to uniformly scale them. Let's do a scale of 1. And so doing a scale of 1 means that some of them are going to go down to virtually 0, which is not what we want. So let's put a scale of 0.5. 0.5. That looks all right. And then I'm just going to scale up my cylinder's radius like that. Okay, good. And then in the cloner, it's a little bit too wide now. So I'm going to just reduce the size of this a little bit, say to 150 by 150. All right. And then I'm just going to have a look at some random distributions. So if I go to the random effector and go to the effector tab, I can change the seed, which will just distribute them in different ways according to that seed. And I'll just keep going till I get to one that I like the look of. All right, that one's quite spaced out, and I quite like it. So that's what we'll pick. Excellent. Okay, so now what we're going to do. So these are going to be our cylinders from where we're going to emit our EFX smoke and fire simulation. But what we need to do is we're going to have to put this in a connect object for that to work. So I'll hold Alt with it highlighted, with the cloner highlighted, and I'll go to this menu and I'll pick connect. And now these are a child of my connect object. And I'm now going to tell this connect object to be an xpReel emitter. So to do that, I'm going to go to tags, xParticles tags, xpReel source tag. So now if I hit play, these are emitting fuel. Okay, good. So that's kind of where we need to be with that. So I also want to use the objects within this to be our particle emitters, and the particles are going to be moved by that fluid simulation. So Mario did this in his scene file, which you can find in our content repository, and it's really, really good. It's a really clever trick. So what he did was this. He brought in a plane, and let's just scale that down to make it similar dimensions to our cloner. So we've got a plane, and we need to make sure that it's intersecting every cylinder, which it is. And now what we're going to do is, I'll tell you what, to demonstrate why this is clever, I'm going to leave that for now, and I'm going to put a material on the plane. So let's create a Cinema 4D material by double clicking here. And if I just double click that, we can bring in the material editor. Right, so in the color channel, I'm going to go to texture and noise, and we can hit this to go into the noise settings. And I want to pick a kind of turbulent, quite detailed noise. So gaseous is one that works well. So that's good. And we're using black and white values with this noise. That's why we want to use it. We want to give the particles black and white values, and we want to tell the emitter to emit from certain areas using these black and white values. And at the moment, it's a little bit too muddy and too grey. So what we're going to do is increase the low clip and reduce the high clip, which will clamp it a bit. Okay. Something like that. We can make adjustments later should we need to. All right, so there's our noise. So I'm going to put our noise on our plane. And there we have it mapped to our plane. So that's pretty good. So now this is why we are going to do this trick that Mario used in his scene. So we've got this noise mapped to the plane. Now what I want to do is I want to emit from this plane, from this noise, but only where these spheres, these cylinders are. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use a boole. So we'll go into this menu and we'll bring in a boole object. And in the boole object, I want to put the plane. And I also want to put our connect object, which has got the cylinders in it. So at the moment, not a lot is happening because the boole is set to A subtract B. So what it's saying is, out of these two objects, take object A, which are the cylinders, and get rid of the plane. And so that's just left the cylinders behind. That's not what we want. If we change that to A intersect B, where we will see where A intersects with B, where the cylinders intersect with the plane, it'll leave behind the geometry. So we should have, if we select this, we should have discs. And there they are. Fantastic. So now we've just got these discs. And because we've got it set up within a boole, it means that this noise texture that we put on the plane remains in place. So every one has a different part of the noise texture applied to it, but it's from the same noise, so it's the same scale and it's the same clipping and whatnot. So it's the same noise, but each one looks fairly random. Excellent. So that's what we want from that. So the xpExplosiaFX is still being emitted from our cylinders, but now we have this boole object which has created these nice discs with this noise texture attached to it, which is good. So I'm just going to switch off my xpExplosiaFX for now. So now what I want to do is bring in an emitter and emit from these discs. So we'll go to xParticles emitter, bring emitter into the scene. We'll go to the object tab of the emitter, and the emitter shape, we're going to change it from rectangle to object. The object from which we want to emit our particles is the boole. It is these discs that the boole's made. So we'll put the boole in there. Excellent. So now if I hit play, we've got particles being emitted from these discs and nowhere else. Very nice. We're going to go one step further. I'll just change the display mode to squares so you can see it, and I'll emit more particles so it becomes more obvious. So there, we've got our squares being emitted from our boole. Now, can you see that it's a bit jittery? And we're getting gaps where there's no emission. Now, I'm not entirely sure of the reason, but I know it's something to do with the way in which the Boole is calculating it. I don't know whether it's because the Boole is making a calculation every frame, and at some point that's interfering with the emission of that particle. But if you click the Create Single Object option within the Boole, it seems to sort that out. I'm not entirely sure why, I'm not clever enough, but it works. So you want to be doing that. So now we've got the emission just from the Boole, but we're going to go one step further because we want to colour these particles and define where they're being emitted from using the noise. So in the emitter settings, in the object tab, we are going to, instead of emitting them from the polygon centre, we're going to emit these particles from a texture. And when I click texture, a new submenu appears, this tab here. And if we go to this tab, I'm able to drag in a texture tag. So I'm going to drag in my noise tag into there. And it's saying it's going to, I'm going to switch off emit for now. So at the moment, it's going to colour the particles using the colour channel. So let's see what happens. So now the particles are being coloured depending on this noise pattern on each disk, which is cool because we're going to be using this variation of from white to black in the color of these particles when we come to render this. And this is the data that is going to allow us to have some parts of these particles glowing blue and some part of them glinting gold reflections and some of them being quite a kind of a dark diffuse material. And we're going to define how we render those in that way by using these black and white color values. So that's why it's really important that we do it. So the only other thing that we're able to do, we can emit from the color channel as well. And what this is going to do is where it is white, it will be emitting at kind of full force. And then as it goes down to gray, it will emit fewer and fewer particles to the point where when it is black, there'll be no particles being emitted whatsoever. There we go. And if I just make a few changes to the noise, you can change the way in which this is happening. So if I move that high clip, we're going to get more and more particles because I'm introducing more lighter tones to the texture. If I increase that, there's going to be fewer and fewer because it's mostly just these white colors. So we don't want it too wide. We want enough particles to play with in the render. That's probably going to do us. But again, we can adjust this along the way. It's procedural, so we're not kind of tied into anything. Right, so obviously we don't want the particles flying up like this. It looks terrible. We want the particles to have no speed whatsoever. So let's go to the emission tab and knock off all the speed. And now they're just being emitted from this noise and not moving anywhere. Good. We want the xpExplosiaFX to move these particles. And let's just switch off the emitter, switch exposure back on. So we want the particles to follow this fluid simulation. So let's look at that fluid simulation and get it moving slightly more like we're going to want it to advect the particles. So first of all, I'm going to take the Boole, which has everything within it, and I'm going to move it down to the bottom of the EFX grid. There we go. That gives us a bit more room to play with. Okay. Very nice. So let's start manipulating this simulation. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to view this. At the moment, we're looking at the fuel and the smoke, which is the fire and the smoke. And this is set in the xpExplosiaFX display settings, fuel and smoke. But I'm actually going to view the temperature output. And I'm going to view the temperature output for a reason. If you can see at the moment, all of these plumes are kind of lifting up at a very uniform rate, which is going to look a little uniform in our render once we get our particles. We want a little bit more variation in how these are rising upwards. And the technique that I'm going to use requires us to kind of view it in temperature mode, which will make sense in a couple of minutes. Right, so at the moment, these are raising up far too quickly. Do you think we're not actually getting real-time playback in our preview here as it's simulating? So in reality, these things are going to be shooting up when we're playing this in real time, and they want to be like a relatively low, slow, kind of languid move up, because this is an underwater scene. So how are we going to slow that down? Well, let's go to our xpExplosiaFX settings, and when you go to the simulation tab, and the way we're going to do this, we're going to control the rise of this fluid using the gravity setting. Now, the gravity setting is a bit hard to get your head around. It doesn't work as most gravity settings and other modifiers would. So if you were to ramp up this gravity setting here, it's not going to make this fluid fall to the ground like gravity would. It's actually going to multiply its speed. And that's because what the gravity does, it multiplies these 3 buoyancy amounts. And so what we actually want to do is take this down from the default of just over 9 to around, I don't know, let's just say 4. Now this should rise up much more slowly. So there you go, that is rising more slowly, but I think it might still be a bit quick. Let's go to 3. And that's better. I think that's looking like a more slow, steady rise up. Now, we've still got this problem that they're all kind of rising in a uniform way. So the way in which we're going to solve this, and why we've changed this to temperature view, is that we're going to make some adjustments in our burning model. So at the moment, we have these default settings: max heat 1, ignition heat of 0, and a burn rate variation of 0.2. The maximum these numbers can go to is 1. Well, they can go way above 1, but they won't do anything. It's 0 to 1, this number. So what we want is we want more burn rate variation. So I'm going to stick that right up to the maximum of 1. But I'm also going to adjust the ignition heat. So at the moment, there is no ignition heat, which means that if I just nip back to my fuel and smoke display, we've got burning, and the burning is then creating this smoke. If I increase my ignition heat up just to the max of 1, you'll notice that it becomes so hot on ignition that it is burning away all of the molecules, and so it isn't actually able to produce any smoke at all. Everything is being burnt by this fire. And by having ignition heat on 1, it means that our burn rate variation has much more of an impact, which means if I now go to my temperature view, we will see that we have more variation in the way in which these are moving up. Look, this is burnt out at this point. This one is burnt out here, and these are moving now in slightly more varied ways. It's not as uniform as it was. So that's working for that. I want more movement in this, and so we're going to include another modifier to do that, a turbulence modifier. So let's go to the modifiers menu, motion, and turbulence. We need to tell Xplosia to be affected by this turbulence. So let's go to the modifier tab of Xplosia and drag it in. So now it will be affected. Let's see what happens. So the turbulence is moving this fluid around on the X, Y, and Z quite a lot. Too much for, I think, what we want. So let's just have a little look at the settings of the turbulence. So I can see that the scale of this is too big. These waves and these curls are too big for our scene. So I'm going to set this down to maybe, I don't know, 40 for now. And it's obviously way too strong as well. And I don't want the turbulence to affect how the fluid is moving up. I want the buoyancy of the FX to be doing that. So I'm going to disable the turbulence on the y-axis. So now it's only affecting the fluid on the x and z axis. That's looking good, and it's way too strong. So let's put this down to, say, I don't know, 1. Okay. And that's looking pretty nice. So it's very difficult to get a real idea of what's happening by viewing the xpExplosiaFX preview. So let's hide that. Let's reintroduce our emitter. And if we hit play, nothing happens. Those particles are just moving ever so slightly. And that's because they're being affected by this turbulence on the X and the Z axis, but not the exposure. We have to tell exposure to advect the particles in the scene. So let's go to advection, switch it on. We don't need to give the particles any smoke, burn, temperature, color, or UV information. We just want the velocity data. So now if we hit play, our particles are being advected. And there we go. And we can move around and we're getting some variation in the way in which these are moving up. Some are going quicker, some are going slower. And this is going to look nice in our render. Right, so we're kind of getting there now. I think we could, let's just go to the emitter settings. At the moment, we have got this display set to squares. Just let's put it to dots so it'll sim a little bit more quickly. That's looking nice. And the emission, how many are we emitting? We're only emitting 10,000 per second, so we need to up that. We're going to want 100,000 per second. Let's have a look at this one. So loads more particles now. And we're kind of getting an idea of how this is going to look once it's rendered nicely. We've got some nice color variation, which we're going to use in cycles to help us render. And I think that's looking good. All right. So that's good. So what we need to do now is we're going to set up a cache for this, because obviously when it comes to rendering, we want to be able to scrub backwards and forwards and try out different bits. And if we cache it, everything is going to work much more quickly. So to get that cache set up, what we need to do is go to the xParticles tab. We'll go to the Other Objects menu and pick an XP cache. Here is our cache object. And we need to get this set up. And, oh, do you know what? I think I've actually forgotten one thing which is going to be really significant when it comes to render time. You wouldn't notice it now, but it will be later. And that is this. I'm just going to go to my emitter. I'm going to reduce the amount of particles that we're emitting, so there's far fewer in the scene, because we need to add some rotation to these particles. Now in dots mode, you're not going to notice this rotation. So let's just go to the display and temporarily change it to boxes. Right. So now we've got these boxes and you can see that their orientation is remaining the same. No matter how they're being pushed by this particle, they aren't rotating in any way. And actually what we want them to do is to rotate in the direction in which they're traveling. And this is going to be used in cycles because we want to play around with getting some light glints bouncing off these particles as they rotate and reflect light from the various light sources. And it's going to be really integral to our final look to be able to do that. So the way we're going to add that rotation is in the emitter, we'll go to the Extended Data tab and we'll click Use Rotation. And the mode we want to set it to tangential rotation. So now if I hit play, you'll see that the particles are always facing the way in which they're traveling. And this is really important to get this variation of rotation, as I say, because we're going to be glinting light and bouncing light off these particles, and by having them rotate like this, those glints will flash on and off, and they're part of this very stylized look. So that rotation is vital. Good. So now we've got that, we'll go back to our display. Let's go back to dots. Let's go back to the emission tab and put it back onto 100,000 particles per second. So now we can't see that rotation is happening, but we know that it's recording that data, and we're going to use that when we get into the render. Excellent. So back to our cache object then. So this is going to be quite a big cache. We're going to be caching about 400 frames. So what I'd advise when you're using a big cache is to cache to external files. So you have this bit selected to external. You then put a file path in this window here, and it will save a cache file for every frame. And this is the way you should do it with large caches. I'm just, for ease's sake of recording this tutorial, I'm going to record this to internal memory, which will save all of that cache data within the Cinema 4D file. But with large caches, that can become a nightmare, because every time you want to save your scene, you have to save all of that cache data over and over again, and it can take forever. So I wouldn't advise you to do it this way. So now I've got that, I'm just going to go to my exclusion tab, and I'm going to exclude the EFX. We don't need to cache this fluid information. It's needless. We just need to cache the position and the color of the particles. Okay, so what I'll do now we're there, we'll go back to the object tag of the cache, and I'm going to hit build cache. This is going to chug away, and I will pause this recording here and come back to you once this cache has finished. So that cache took about 4 minutes to get through. I stopped caching it at 311 frames because I'm not going to need any more than that in our render. So let's just change our timeline to 311. And so the cache used 9.32 gigabytes of data. That's how big it is. So that means that every single time, because I saved it internally, every single time I save this Cinema 4D file, it has to save that much data, which means it's going to take forever. So it's not a very sensible way of working. And that's why I urged you, if you're going to do this, cache it to external files. So then it'll hold all of that cache information in a separate folder, which means that you're able to save and incrementally save this Cinema 4D file really quickly and easily. And it's a much more sensible way of working. So now that we have our cache sorted, the particles, the color and their position has been cached. So I can disable all of this other stuff that was driving our scene. I can disable all of the Boole stuff, xpExplosiaFX, the random effector, and the turbulence. I don't need any of that. The only thing I need active in the scene is the emitter and the cache object. And now we can scrub through backwards and forwards and look at our animation. And if we play it, it probably won't play in real time, but we'll get decent playback because it's not having to chug through and make xpExplosiaFX calculations now. So that's looking pretty nice. We've got some nice varied rising. We've got our particles, which are coloured with varying degrees of black and white, which we're going to use in the render to get the effect that we want. And of course, this can be rendered from lots of different angles. The render that we are going to be looking at is the one from the reel where the particles kind of whoosh up past the camera. So something like this movement as they come upwards. And we can mess around with which angle we want to use that from, but that's the look that we're going for. But obviously you can shoot this from whatever angle you wish. You can just come in very close to one of these plumes and have it coming up, and it's going to look nice. Okay, so the cache is there. All of the data is contained within this to get the looks that we require in our render. So this is going to finish part 1 of this particle advection tutorial. In part 2, we're going to be looking at how Mario rendered this in Cycles 4D. Don't forget, loads of free content and tutorials on the INSYDIUM YouTube channel. Go along, hit subscribe, and you'll always get the brand new content as soon as it's released. So until next time, I'll see you later.